Staying alive, staying alive. Ooh, ooh. Yeah, the 70s, as we've been saying now for a while, it's pretty obvious now that the stagflation of the 1970s is back. Get out those powder blue leisure suits.
Right. Well, I'm wearing red velvet. Velvet was pretty big back in the 70s. So was crocheted knit sort of stuff.
I used to wear a crocheted vest and pants. No undergarments.
Really, really. And then there was satin. There was terry cloth. There were a few cheesy things back then.
Denim suits.
But there were also gasoline shortages. We mentioned that the last episode. And I want to say we still have gasoline shortages here. So all I have are these plastic baggies. And I'm willing to send it to anybody in the audience. If you could fill it up with gasoline and post it back to me. Apparently, this is the way it's done here in America. So I need some gasoline because we have to get to the airport next week. So, you know, the thing is, I need to get there. And it needs some energy.
It's pretty sad. People at the gas station, you know, filling up plastic bags with gasoline. You know, I saw somebody, getting some prophylactics out of the men's room vending machine and filling that up with gasoline. I don't think that's going to work. But, you know, these are crazy times.
Right. So I want to talk about some of the other situations which are crazy. You know, they rhyme with the past, sometimes with the 70s, sometimes with the 60s, sometimes with 2008 financial crisis. And we see the kind of the crazy. Remember, we have a lot of inflation going on, and the Federal Reserve says it's just transitory, Max. But Goldman, we expect that a national housing shortage will fuel substantial home price appreciation for at least a couple more years. We project that shelter inflation exceeds 4% in 2023, a higher rate than at any point in the prior economic cycle. Hyper-transitory, hyperinflation, Zero Hedge calls it. Big boom in house prices they're predicting as they say shelter inflation.
The portrait of Dorian Gray. You know that story up in the attic. The portrait of Dorian Gray is aging, while Dorian Gray himself is not aging. Why do I mention that? Because in America, there's been rampant inflation now for 20 years, but it's been hiding because the labor force was outsourced to China. And the asset prices that are owned by the top 0.1% kept going up because of all the money printing, but they didn't really think that was a problem. Now, parity of wages between China and America means that you can't outsource wage inflation anymore. And it's coming back. And the inflation genie, once out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. That's what history tells us. And this idea of transitory inflation is yet another phrase uttered by the central banker. Today it's Jay Powell. That is patently, provably, demonstrably a lie. A lie.
You know, somebody responded to Zero Hedge with this comment on Twitter: hyper-transitory hyperinflation, hyper-Bitcoinization, because Bitcoin does fix it, right? What you're seeing right now is also reminding us of not only the 70s when we had the stagflation. And this time the stagflation, remember, we had low growth in jobs back in the 70s, but really high inflation. Well, now we have the really high inflation, loads of jobs available, but everybody's getting so much free money that they don't want to work. So there's loads of jobs available, but nobody wants to take them. But hyper-Bitcoinization in terms of, you know, having a neutral reserve currency, a neutral trade currency, how that could benefit the rest of the world. Because remember back in 2008, during that financial crisis, what followed were the Arab Spring and uprisings. And why that happened was the price of wheat, remember? But also back in that time period, we had riots in other places around the world, including Haiti and Mexico, because of food prices. So we're having a similar thing with all this money printing going on, and it's epic amounts of and fiscal stimulus as well in the United States. And that's causing, if you think it's causing inflation here, it's causing even higher inflation in the developing world and people who, in nations where they can't print dollars, but they are being like sent all these dollars from America. Spiking inflation, rate hikes, and debt defaults in Latin America. Mexico and Brazil, having seen the economic destruction that high inflation can wreak, don't want to see it again. According to Wall Street, Latin America will soon be hit by a wave of business bankruptcies and defaults, according to Jesus Urdangare Lopez, the CEO of CESCE, Spain's biggest provider of export finance and insurance. CESCE insures companies mainly from Spain against the risk of their customers not paying due to bankruptcy or insolvency. It also manages export credit insurance on behalf of the Spanish state. They're paid to basically know the risk of the defaults and bankruptcies coming, and they're coming, he said.
Right. This is part two of the 2008 global financial crisis, when it hit in 2008 because global credit froze, because banks made trillions of dollars worth of loans that suddenly went bad because they were fraudulently induced. And there was a big bailout. Barack Obama and Geithner and Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General, they wrote a check for, let's call it $18 trillion to Wall Street. And they said, oh, guys, do better next time. So Wall Street took that $18 trillion and they created $120 to $150 trillion worth of new derivatives that have a resale value of zero. They sold those to the central bank and they took dollars. And then those dollars, because now you can't hide the inflation anymore by outsourcing labor, they're entering the real economy. They're calling velocity. And so prices are going up all over the world. And we see now everything you need to see before you see some kind of insurrection. We saw it in Egypt, and we saw it in Tunisia. And we've seen it before. We saw huge protests in Athens during the 2008 crisis. So this is part two of the 2008 crisis. As we said, after that was ameliorated with money printing, we said, this will come back in 10 to 12 years, but 10 to 20 times worse. So here we are, 10 years later, 12 years later, and it's 10 to 20 times worse. And it's the 1970s, but it's got a 21st century flavor about it. So you've got now social media meets John Travolta, right? You've got the Bee Gees meets Mark Zuckerberg. You put those together and it births the catastrophe that we're living through now. So it's got a disco beat, but it's got a social media vibe.
Well, speaking of vibes, before I go on to the story about the inflation in Latin America, I do want to say that by the next episode, maybe the one after that, you'll be hearing a massive vibe outside as well, because not only do we have COVID lockdowns, they're just being relaxed. Not only do we have gasoline shortages and people, filling plastic Tupperware bowls and other sort of things with gasoline, but the cicadas, the 17-year cycle hits this in the next few days, maybe few hours or whatever, but you're going to hear massive cicada noises. They could hit up to 100 decibels if they're flying by. You wouldn't even hear a jumbo jet landing. They could drown out a jumbo jet. They're that loud.
We're having a plague of locusts?
Yes.
Oh, that's so 2021. Looking forward to it.
These are cicadas, so we'll see how loud they are. Hopefully it'll be fun, or it's a nice beat and a rhythm so we could dance to it. But in terms of the food price inflation and what happened back in that whole period, led by the last melt up boom, the crack up boom that we had in 2005, 6, 7, like leading up to the 2008 crash. Was driven mostly by a housing boom at that time, and you had food price inflation kicking off all over the place. Remember, and oil prices went up to $147 a barrel. You had commodity price inflation. You had gold prices hitting all-time highs at that time. And then you had the food riots. The price of wheat went up for Egypt and Tunisia. In Haiti, they had massive food riots. In Mexico, you also had the tortilla riots, and they're warning about that again because the price of food is rising sharply. Corn prices have more than doubled since August last year. This has fueled higher prices for corn tortillas, the quintessential staple in Mexican diet and cuisine, which have reached their highest average level since 2017. One of the last times prices rose this fast in 2006, and it led to food riots. Part of the situation that's going on is that there is a flood of cash into, the article points out, the U.S. economy. Canadian, Australia, UK. They're printing a lot of money, giving it to their citizens, but the Latin American countries can't print any money. So they're suffering a huge deflationary situation to their GDP, down 7% on average across the region. And on top of that, like boom times for these other massive economies just right above them.
Right. It all comes back to the fallacy of central planning, right? Government central planners cannot plan an economy at scale. You can get the local PTA meeting to plan the lunch break of kindergartners. That's about as scaling as you can get to get a committee to understand how to do anything. Once you go past that kindergarten level, things fall apart. Every country that tries to rely entirely on central planning to create price signals has failed, without exception. America is trying to bring in price controls. They are manipulating the price of money. They're trying to create the price control of interest rates. They are trying to force banks to do stuff on behalf of the government. And it's become an autocracy and a kleptocracy.
Right. So this global financial situation, which we said hyper-Bitcoinization will fix, is the instability of the global financial grid, whereby everybody's beggaring thy neighbor. Back in the 40s, the 30s, we beggared thy neighbor using deflationary tactics by pulling yourself off the gold standard or confiscating your citizens' gold. Now we're doing a beggar thy neighbor with inflation and hyperinflation. So there's already been several defaults happening on the government level. Argentina is now negotiating another default. They've already defaulted once this year, so they're in the past 12 months, so they're going to default again. And Mexico is in a situation whereby their economy contracted by 8.5%, and in Mexico as well, the inflation is at 6.1%. Brazil, however, has had the worst situation, whereby they did, unlike most of the other economies down in Latin America, they did do a lot of deficit spending and hand out money, for the COVID lockdowns or COVID situation to deal with it. They didn't have lockdowns like we did. But Brazil, their inflation is running at 6.8%. And the central bank has been responding by huge, 75 basis point increases in their Fed funds rate. But their debt ballooned to 89% of GDP, which is, obviously less than what the U.S. has. But the U.S. has a reserve currency, so we're just printing it and beggaring thy neighbors down south. And here, they're looking like they could have a debt crisis there, because that's pretty high for an emerging economy.
Right. They've had, remember the previous Mexican debt crisis, and they launched a bunch of bonds. I believe they're called the tortilla bonds or something like that.
Tequila bonds.
The tequila bonds. So, but we're seeing this all replay of all multiple problems for decades all happen at once, which is kind of interesting. Plus the locust plagues, plus COVID. Hey, great year so far. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with David Morgan of the Morgan Report. David, welcome back.
Max, thank you.
We've been chatting about inflation and what's happening in the economy. Seemingly things are falling apart. And it seems like a great environment for gold and silver. So what are we looking at there? Are these two going to wake up? What's going on, David?
Boy, that's a tough one. I usually have a pretty good answer on that question, but, gold and silver obviously have been the go-to safe haven for centuries. And they have lost some status there. I think it has to do with the technology boom and people thinking everything has to have a technological basis. I mean, you've seen the cryptocurrencies really come to the fore as an alternative currency to the nation state currencies, be it the US dollar reserve currency or any one you want to name, the euro, the pound, the, any Canadian dollar, Aussie dollar, doesn't matter. All these currencies are floating against each other. They're not a function of how much natural resources are in the country. They're a function of who's printing the most fiat the fastest, and that's hard to get a handle on. So people are looking for alternatives, and a lot of the alternatives, again, have gone into cryptos. Gold, I think, has built a strong base, and I'm looking for it to break above the 1850 level to get us up into the next leg. I think gold and cryptos could coexist. I don't think they're independent of each other. I think they're both alternatives. I think gold actually is a bit more decentralized than some of the cryptos. I mean, the KYC and the international money laundering laws and everything else that exists around the financial asset sector are, I'll say they're important. But what's interesting about a silver coin or a gold coin is, if it's in your pocket, you can make a pretty decentralized exchange without a whole lot of red tape.
And the point a lot of people make is that gold is actually 100% fungible, which in the crypto world, that's not the case. But my question is this, like there's about $100 trillion worth of investable assets around the world that is being managed, professionally managed. It's people looking for returns. And we know that something like 1% of that is invested in gold bullion. How come these rich people who have $100 trillion to spend aren't, even despite the failure of gold to really get good price discovery due to all the shenanigans we've been reporting on, it would seem like the global rich could overpower that if they were concerned and wanted a safe haven, and they come from the boomers and older, they know gold. They're not going to jump into Bitcoin if you're 60 years old. So where are they? What's going on? Are they all in a nursing home? What happened here? I mean, there seems like there's a tremendous buying power that could be unleashed on gold, but it's dormant. Why?
I think people are more reactive than proactive. I mean, I'm a big believer in the Exter pyramid, where you go from illiquid investments to the most liquid investment. And it's an upside down pyramid. You could look it up if you want to know more. It's called the Exter pyramid, EXTER. And what you find is as the derivatives bubble unwinds further, you have less faith in the currencies. The corporate bond market's blowing up because the only thing keeping it alive is the Fed is buying corporate debt. And all these things start to compound. So as you come down the liquidity pyramid, you go to safer and safer assets. The safest asset before you get to the ultimate currency is US paper dollars, physical currency. And that is, and there'll be a run to physical currency. I truly believe the Exter pyramid from a macro perspective has it correct. And once you get to that point, then it becomes trusting the dollar, trusting something greater than the dollar. So as the dollar starts to deteriorate on an inflationary basis where you don't know what it's going to be worth, you start to see the yield curve react to the reality of what's happening in the debt markets, then there'll be the run to gold. So I think everything you said, Max, is accurate. And I just think people like to follow the leader. There's very few out there that lead. So most people follow. So once you get that 1% to 1.5% to 2%, and then that doubles to 4% in the last 3 months of the gold run, you're going to see astronomical paper prices in both the metals, in my view. But I think it's that trigger point, that tipping point, that change of consciousness, that one place where all of a sudden somebody moves money too far or too fast or the wrong way, or somebody in the bond vigilante group actually takes a stand and gets, out of the corporate bond market and can't extract themselves without a bid-ask spread that's been bigger than anything we've seen in a decade. I mean, there's so many black swans, and you're as familiar with them as I am, Max, but there's a lot out there that could happen. It just hasn't taken place where people have gotten scared enough to take action to move down the liquidity pyramid.
Right. So there's complacency and, the older wealth, the multi-generational wealth, they've seen it all before, and they know that patience is a virtue, and that they don't need to be chasing every fad. But you're saying that all it would take is one shift in perception, and it would start this kind of move into gold, and then it would build on itself. Now, you mentioned that a run on paper money could be something, or the actual treasury bill, the treasury notes, they could be in short supply. We already have shortages in microchips. In other goods, obviously gas is now, there's a shortage and there's a problem there. And there's also a shortage of workers. Now, this is interesting, historically speaking. Get your take on this. The government transfer payments are now equal to over $16 an hour. So it's more than 2 times minimum wage. And people are saying, I'm not going to go back to work. Just keep sending me this money. And some states are now trying to outlaw that and force people back to work. But once the blue-collar worker has a taste of what Ken Griffith over there at Citadel does, that is, do nothing all day and collect free money from the government, and Warren Buffett, bums, Why should they go back to work? Why should you make people work on one hand, when you've got a whole class of folks in the hedge fund industry that are just given trillions of dollars for free for doing nothing? Why should anyone go back to work? And then why shouldn't they just continue to get this free money, David?
Well said, Max. I think if I can take a step back, it has to do with the destruction of the currency base. There's a direct correlation between the debasement of the currency and the debasement of the moral structure of a society. And that's what we're basically talking about, is the moral structure. I mean, who would want to work for $8 an hour when they're getting paid 16 not to work? I mean, I don't think I would volunteer to work. But it has to do, again, with the morality of the money supply itself. Is the money legit or isn't it? And I'm going to suck off the whomever is printing this stuff until it fails. And that's when the big wake-up call takes place. So I think we're going to see a continuation of what you just outlined. I mean, most of the subscribers to my premium service are small business owners. And these guys have earned it the old-fashioned way, and a lot of them aren't in the invest-only or Warren Buffett category. These are people that actually built it, usually by themselves, and then started gaining employees. And these are the backbone of the society, which is being decimated under the illness control. So I'm very sympathetic to the hardworking class that's maybe has better than average incomes at this point in time, because they did it the old-fashioned way. They earned it. But now, if you can't get people that are willing to perform because of this discrepancy between working for a living or voting for a living, we've got a real mess on our hands.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that the message from the plutocrats and the folks that are on the receiving end of the Cantillon effect of just getting all the free cash are morally lecturing those people at the bottom that it's good for their moral rectitude if they go and do these menial jobs for minimum wage, non-living wages. And it's like America's run by the Khmer Rouge suddenly. Like we've got the killing fields, across from coast to coast, and you've got to work, to re-educate. It's a re-education camp, David, in America now. Work for a minimum wage so you can morally improve yourself. This is I've been around for a while. I can't imagine. I don't remember a time when there was such a disconnect between the leadership of the country and the rank and file of the population, where the leadership has become so corrupt, so venal, so disgusting. I mean, you whiff the acrid smell in the air of insurrection, David Morgan. Am I going too far? What do you think?
I think you're right. As I said earlier, when we turn this thing around, and I said after you hit bottom, we're on the slippery slope. The physical economy is contracting. It's also accelerating. And once you get a complex society to have multiple failures, you start to accelerate, which we're doing. And then you're just going to slide down until you again hit bottom. And once you've hit bottom, then you can start to rebuild. So I think we have a moral lesson for all of us on a global basis. And I think that the main thing I can stress is an attitude. First of all, be very aware of what's really going on in the physical economy. Don't worry about the DJI averages or what the bond markets are doing necessarily, although debt is probably the most important factor. It's what's going outside your window as you drive down and see how many more store closures there are, how much more unemployment there is, and how few people are willing to work for half the pay you can get for a universal basic income that may continue. So we have a mess on our hands, Max, but we, the human species, have overcome these things time and time again. As you know, from the Four Horsemen, these things cycle through. We're at the top of the cycle. We've already peaked. The hardest thing for people, I think, to understand is to see a top. I've seen the top. We've been there. We have hit the peak. That was a few years ago. We're coming back down, and it's going to accelerate.
Very poetic. Getting back to the bond vigilante question, they've been absent for years. These are the folks that would sell off the bond market if the government was printing too much money. What if the bond vigilante is China? In other words, China and the U.S. have had this symbiotic relationship for years. We send you our jobs, you send us the money, and we're going to buy our U.S. treasuries. What if China suddenly says, you know what, we're out? What happens?
I think that's extremely accurate. And of course, you could do it similar to the Big Short. You could have multiple options on the downside, buy puts, et cetera. You could do it with multiple banks. You could position yourself quite well, and then you could start to sell. And there you go. I think it's actually very probable that something along those lines, perhaps not exactly, is going to take place.
So that's more of geopolitical, and that fits back into gold. Of course, China's a big buyer of gold. Russia's a big buyer of gold. These other countries that have been part of the U.S. dollar hegemony since World War II in the last 5-6 years have been huge buyers of gold. Clearly, they see the end of disco days for the dollar, and they're preparing accordingly. And they could do a massive rug pull on the U.S. dollar. But in the end, though, they seem to be buying a lot of gold, and that seems to be maybe still a good idea, David. We've got about 20 seconds.
I see it going to central bank digital currency. China's already in place. They basically implemented it. I think it could work with that alone, but if it fails, they'll have to go back central bank digital currency. I think that's the path we're on, Max.
All right, central bank digital currencies, certainly they're in play and huge. David Morgan, thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, David Morgan of the Morgan Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.